And now I'm going to introduce Stephanie Zavon to introduce our speaker. Stephanie Zavon is a former associate president of Minnesota Atheists. She is a longtime host of our Atheists Talk radio program, where she interviewed Greta Christina this morning. She was the major organizer of our 2015 Secular Women Work Conference. Along with Greta Christina, she is a blogger on the New Orbit Network. Stephanie Zavon.
It is always a joy to get to introduce somebody like Greta Christina. And honestly, there just aren't that many people like Greta Christina. She is one of the people I look to in this movement when I need inspiration, when I need, frankly, talking down, when I need a reality check. She has done more than most people I know, and I know a fair number of organizers in this movement, to make us all grow up and come to terms with the fact that we're actually turning into a major movement, and that's some power and that's some responsibility, and we should take it seriously and we should do a really good job with it. I could tell you again about all the books, but honestly I suggest you come up and check them out and find the one that speaks to you at the moment, because one of the great things about how Greta writes is that she actually does a lot of listening to people before she writes a book. And there is a whole lot of wisdom from a whole lot of atheists in those books. And you are pretty much guaranteed to find something that will speak to you. And that's how her blog has always been. That's really just what she does. And the fact that she now has a book coming out just talking about how we live our everyday lives as atheists, as opposed to necessarily people who are still struggling with religion, is something that I think a lot of us can really use at this point. We can really, it's freeing, frankly, to start to think about what you do going forward instead of where you came from in your past. So that's not entirely what she's here to talk about tonight, although it is somewhat. But I will, at this point, get out of her way and say, Greta, it is so good to welcome you here.
God, I'm not crying, you're crying. Thank you so much. And Stephanie, I'm really touched by that, because you're also one of the people that I look to in this movement for guidance and inspiration, and either talking down or the opposite as appropriate. And thank you all so much. Thanks to Minnesota Atheists for making this happen. Thanks to all the organizers. It's I know I do a little bit of community organizing at home in San Francisco, and enough to know that it's a lot of work, and sometimes it's just kind of boring work, and just on the on the ground community activism and organizing it's a thankless job, so thank you. So what I'm talking about today is practicing atheism in everyday life. So you're an atheist. Now what? What does it mean to live as an atheist? Living without religion is not always so different from living with it. Atheists and believers are all human beings. We laugh at jokes, we listen to music, we care about our loved ones, we try to be good people. But there are real differences. When you think the meaning of your life is handed to you by God, you're going to live differently than if you think we create our own meaning. When you think God is your co-pilot and your life is planned by this perfect, all-knowing creator who still gave you sinuses for no apparent reason, you're going to live differently than if you think nobody is driving this bus and you'd better grab the wheel. When you think that you and your loved ones are going to live forever in a blissful afterlife where everybody somehow magically gets along, even though you never did, you're going to live differently. than if you accept that this short life is the only one that we have. You know, there are differences between a religious life and a godless one, and they are not trivial. So the narrowest definition of atheism is that it's simply the conclusion that there are no gods. And if you want to define atheism that way, that's fine. I actually strongly feel that we get to define this language for ourselves, and we all define it somewhat differently, and that's fine. But so if you conclude that all atheism is, it's the conclusion that there are no gods, that's fine, but conclusions don't exist in a vacuum. Conclusions have implications. Sometimes those implications are profound, and that includes the conclusion that gods don't exist. So for me, and for many people, atheist doesn't just mean I don't believe in God. It also means the values and the ways of life implied by that conclusion or inspired by that conclusion. It means the skeptical, evidence-based ways of thinking that made us non-believers in the first place. And it means the communities, the organizations, and the movements that are springing up among people who don't believe in gods. Now, again, if you want to use different language about this, that's fine. If you want to use the words humanism, skepticism, or organized atheism to mean these things, that's totally fine with me. But whatever we call it, that's what I'm talking about today. Once we accept that there are no gods, how can that shape our lives? How do we decide what it means to be good with no gods writing the rule book and handing out justice if people get it wrong or right? How do we create meaning for our own lives when we accept that there are no gods creating that meaning for us? How do we deal with illness, suffering, injustice, and death without belief in an afterlife or a supernatural being who's going to make everything okay? How do we deal with the rise of fascism, with tampered elections, with the frightening and dangerous world ahead of us? Again, without belief in a supernatural being who's going to make everything okay. Content note, I am going to be talking about the election tonight. It's not all I'm talking about, but I am going to be talking about it. How do we create communities for ourselves and support each other in our individuality while still coming together as a coherent whole, or something vaguely resembling a coherent whole? How do we experience pleasure and joy and wonder in a brief, fragile, finite life? So I have, in fact, written a book about this. It's called The Way of the Heathen, Practicing Atheism in Everyday Life. And much of this talk is taken from ideas in that book. And when you, actually, I'm going to grab a copy of the book to show you this. When you look at the cover of the book, what you see is this visual joke. The title of the book is The Way of the Heathen. And the cover art shows this person walking down a road which branches into lots of different roads. There is no way of the heathen. I'm not telling you the one right way to be an atheist. What I'm offering is questions to think about, ideas that may be useful, and encouragement to choose your own way. Actually, put this back before I forget. So let's start with some big picture stuff. What does it all mean? I love that question. It's such a deepity question. It doesn't actually mean anything. But let's narrow that question right down. What does it all mean? When we don't believe in gods or the supernatural, how does that affect our fundamental relationship with reality? How does what we don't believe change how we see the meaning of our lives? So when I talk about religion, and especially when I talk about why I think religion is mistaken, I sometimes get told by believers that I should be more open to the universe. I've been told, a belief system based on what isn't seems reductive. And, when I turn my mind towards the things I don't believe, my world gets smaller. It's the solstice, so I'm not going to make a rude gesture. So I do have a belief system. Every atheist I know has a belief system. We have values and priorities that shape how we live. So why is not believing in things, not believing in gods, souls, the supernatural, so crucial to that worldview? Because I believe in reality. I believe that reality is far more important and far more interesting than anything I could make up about it. And I believe that trying to understand reality is one of the most valuable things that we can do. You know, the real universe is magnificent. It is fascinating, and it is way weirder than anything we could make up about it. I mean, space that bends, continents that drift, brain goop that makes consciousness, solid matter that's mostly empty space. You know, that rocks my world. And we have found all this amazing stuff out by letting go of preconceptions and rejecting ideas that aren't supported by evidence. But that's the thing. The negative part of this process, the rejection part of this process, is crucial. You know, we can't say, yes, the Earth orbits the sun. Wow, that's kind of amazing. Without also saying, no, the sun does not orbit the Earth. You know, we can't say, yes, the continents are moving. Are you kidding me? Really? Without also saying, no, the continents are not fixed in place. We can't say this stuff is almost certainly true without also saying all that other stuff is almost certainly not true. There is an impossibly huge infinitude of things that we could imagine about the universe, and only the tiniest fraction are actually true. So if we are going to be open to the world, if we're going to be open to the mind-altering magnificence and freakiness of reality, we have to be willing to say no to the overwhelming majority of things that we can imagine about it. We have to be rigorous in sorting reality from unreality and relentless in rejecting unreality. Now, I have no problems with stories about imaginary realities. You know, movies, television, books, you know, the horror stories you tell it around the campfire. You know, these are essential parts of our human lives. They're how we create. They're part of how we create meaning and how we frame our experience, and they're also just fun. But if we care about reality, we have to not fool ourselves into thinking that our stories are true. Our world does not get bigger when we value our experience of reality more than reality itself. It doesn't get bigger when we treat every possibility as equally likely and choose between them based on which ones we like best. It doesn't get bigger when we ignore or deny evidence. It doesn't get bigger when we armor ourselves against reality. Our world gets bigger when we let reality in. Reality is bigger than us, and we get bigger when we let it in. It gets bigger when we pay careful attention to reality and let it take priority over our opinions about it. Our world gets bigger when we let reality be what it is. And reality is what I believe in. Hang on a second. The air is so dry here. Now, believing in a reality, that might seem like an oxymoron. Doesn't everybody do that? You know, doesn't everybody think that the things they believe are true? That's what it means, right? And doesn't everybody think that's important, to believe things that are true? But one of the many very hard lessons we've learned from the political and religious landscape in the last few years, and especially in the last year, is that for millions of people, reality is at best a very low priority, and at worst is their open enemy. You know, and this isn't just a right-wing phenomenon. You know, there is fake news and confirmation bias and clinging to disproven ideas everywhere on the political and religious spectrum. But this tendency is very strongly amplified by the right wing's naked hunger for power at any cost, including the cost of blatantly disregarding the truth. And it's amplified by the religious right proudly embracing faith over facts, not just as acceptable, but as virtuous. And if there's anything that the growing atheist, humanist, and secular communities can contribute to the political and moral landscape in the coming years and decades, I think it might be this: at least in theory, and sometimes in practice, we care about reality, and we prioritize truth over our own opinions. We're a community with a very interesting common thread. For most of us, the thing that we have in common is that we admitted that we were wrong about something really important. That's not true for all of us. Some people were raised as atheists, but for those of us who used to be religious, that's what we have in common, is that we admitted that we were wrong. That is a real gift. It's a gift that we have to give to each other, and I think it's a gift we have to give to the world. And it is a very powerful value to hang on in difficult, grim times. And I would encourage all of us to adhere to that value and to step up our game on it. So let's talk a bit about being better people. Let's talk a bit about stepping up our game. What does that mean, especially in dangerous or difficult times? Let's talk about ethics. When we don't have a rule book telling us, here's what it means to be a good person, what does it mean to be a good person? And how does a commitment to reality affect what we do when we're trying to be good? Now, the most obvious way that a commitment to reality helps us be good is that a better understanding of reality helps us do better things. Understanding cause and effect helps us cause the effects that we want. If we want to help somebody who's sick, for instance, it's important to know, okay, this medicine is likely to help them, this other medicine is going to maybe make them worse, and praying to our God is not going to do a thing. If we want to be good and do good things, we have to accept realities about cause and effect. But there's another way that accepting reality helps make us good people. And it has to do with accepting some difficult realities about ourselves. So we all think of ourselves as good people. This is one of our ways that our brains are wired. We know that we're flawed, but we think of ourselves as basically good. What does that mean? There are a couple of different ways to think of ourselves as good people. The first is by rationalizing. This is a cognitive bias that all skeptics should be aware of. Our brains, and that means all of us, every human brain, is programmed to think that whatever we've done, it's smart, competent, and ethical. Whatever it is. The minute we do anything, our brain rushes in to tell us how awesome it was. We think of ourselves as good people. And so when we do something harmful or foolish, our brains rush in with these explanations for why it was acceptable or even virtuous. We start with the assumption that we're good and we go from there. We think of being good as something we are, an essential part of our nature. The other way to think of ourselves as good people means understanding that we aren't always good. It means questioning and doubting. It means asking ourselves, am I doing the right thing here? Did I do the right thing back then? Could I have done something better, something different? It means understanding that being good can be hard, that it sometimes involves difficult choices, sometimes involves making the least bad choice. It means constantly examining what being good even means. It means thinking of being good less as something that we are and more as something that we do, and therefore as something that's more fragile. Very few people think of themselves as evil. That sort of cartoon villain, rubbing their hands together and cackling over their beautiful wickedness. That is, I don't think it's non-existent, but it's very, very rare. There is a reason that our brains start rationalizing what we do as soon as we do it. There is a reason that, paradoxically and very frustratingly, we're actually more likely to rationalize our behavior when we've done something a lot, when we've committed more time and resources to it, when we've publicly gone out on a limb for it, or when we've done something really, really bad. We don't enjoy thinking of ourselves as bad people. We can barely stand it. Seeing ourselves as bad is so painful, we will deny reality, cut off people we care about, even continue doing the same awful things again and again and digging ourselves deeper into the same hole rather than admit that we screwed up. And here's the thing, it can be very comforting to externalize evil, to see it as something the bad guys do, to sort of imagine the cackling villains and position evil over there on them. But this is a false comfort, and it's a very dangerous one. If we learned anything from the Milgram experiment or from the Stanford prison experiment, It's that evil is not that thing out there. It is a way of being. It is a capacity that all of us have. We all have the capacity to be bigoted, to be corrupted by power, to obey orders or go along with the crowd, even when we know it's wrong, to reflexively defend ourselves and people on our side, even when we've done something awful. And we all have the capacity to hate and dehumanize people who we see as not being like us. We need to be willing to see evil, not as something people are, but as something people do, and therefore as something that we might do. We need to accept that we, as human beings, we have empathy and moral instincts that evolved in us as a social species. And we also have self-preservation instincts that evolved in us as a species that, is still alive. And we need to understand that these are always going to be in conflict. And we need to be willing to ask, not are we the good guys, but are we doing the right thing? And we need to ask it again and again for as long as we live. Now, the self-doubt does have its downsides. It makes it very easy to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And it can be immobilizing. We can get so worried about doing the right thing, it keeps us from doing anything at all. We sometimes think, of rationalization, those of us who understand rationalization, we think of it as this weird glitch in our brains, but it is actually essential. We would be frozen without it. We'd be unable to act. So I keep thinking about what Hillel, the Rabbi Hillel I'm blanking on what century he lived in, many centuries ago. The Rabbi Hillel said, and this is a poor translation from ancient Hebrew, if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, who am I? We have to be ourselves if we're going to survive. We have to be others for others if our lives are going to have meaning. And we have to constantly tinker with that balance. That balance is going to be different in every situation. And the ways that we think about being good are part of that balance. If we're going to function, we have to see ourselves as good people. But if we want that goodness to be meaningful, we have to be willing, at least sometimes, to question it. And this is going to become even more important in the difficult years and decades to come. Hang on. In distressing times and dangerous times, being ethical, including this issue, this ethical issue of being willing to question our own ethical choices, it's more difficult in difficult times, and it's more important. It's more difficult because we're faced with harder ethical conundrums where the stakes are higher. When there's desperate need all around us, how do we decide who to help? That's always a difficult question. But it becomes much more difficult when the need is greater and greater and greater every day, every week, every month, every year, and when our own resources are stretched increasingly thin. When we're building alliances, which ethical differences do we accept and which ones are deal breakers? That's always a hard question, but it becomes harder when the stakes are higher. When alliance building is more important than ever, and intersectionality is also more important than ever. And when everybody trying to work together is stressed, on edge, and has a hair-trigger temper. And when we're fighting evil. And yes, I am going to say it. The hard right, white supremacist, misogynist, hatefully and violently bigoted, self-enriching, foxes guarding every henhouse fascism that is on the rise in the United States is evil. When we're fighting evil people who have made it clear that they have essentially no limits in how dirty they will fight to gain power and to retain power, how dirty do we get our own hands? If we always fight squeaky clean, I guarantee you that we will lose. If we put no limits on how dirty we'll fight, we become the evil that we're fighting. Where do we draw that line? In dangerous times, being good is more difficult and it's more important. There's more at stake. And I don't know how to answer these questions. And in the coming years, I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot of them wrong. But when I'm trying to make these hard choices, one of the foundations that I'm going to be hanging on to, one of the beacons that I'm going to be looking at is going to be, does this choice reflect reality? So, accepting reality can help us be better people. What are some other ways that it can help us in our everyday lives? How does accepting reality help us through tough times? And I don't just mean the big political tough times. I just mean, I mean that. And I also mean the ordinary rises and falls in our life. How do we cope with suffering, with injustice, with death, without belief in a God who has a plan or an afterlife where everything's going to magically be sorted out? There's a lot of directions that we could take this question. We could talk about coping with illness, bad luck, depression, grief, our own mortality. But because of the disaster of November 8th, I want to take this in a different direction. I want to talk about some hard realities of injustice. I want to talk about resistance. And I want to talk about injustice and resistance not as a crisis, but as a permanent condition of our lives. I want to talk about permanent struggle. And I didn't write this section in response to the election. I actually wrote this a while ago. This is a subject I've been thinking about for a while. But the idea of permanent struggle became much more relevant after the election, and I am trying very hard to make peace with it. I'm trying to make peace with the idea that in almost every struggle I care about passionately, I am going to live the rest of my life without winning. The day I die, there is still going to be hatred of women, disgust for queers, contempt for Black and brown people, revulsion for trans people, pointless poverty, grotesque inequality, and stinking rich people who don't give a damn about any of it as long as they've got theirs. That was true before the election, and it's more true now. I'm trying to make peace with the idea of survival as victory, the idea of harm reduction, the idea that shoving the world into a slightly better place, even a slightly less awful place, is a form of winning. I'm trying to let go of the entire idea of winning. And obviously, I am doing a lousy job. I'm trying to make peace with how much of our progress isn't really progress, so much as it is digging our way out of a hole. So much of our progress means alleviating suffering, righting inequalities, pushing back against bigotry and hatred and brutality that should never have been there in the first place. So much of progress isn't building something new, it's just building a level foundation. It's not adding positive numbers, it's just struggling to get to zero. And I'm okay with the idea of permanent struggle. Okay, obviously I'm not. That's a big fat lie. I'm beginning to see okay on the horizon. I am profoundly not okay with how much of the struggle is such a waste of time. And I mean, of course the work is worth doing. It's not a waste of time in that sense. The foundation is wildly uneven. There are tons of holes to dig out of. It's work worth doing, but we shouldn't have to do it. We wouldn't have to do it if we didn't have such a terrible history and if people today weren't terrible so much of the time. I am trying to make peace with how much we could build, how high we could climb, if so many of us weren't digging out of these pointless, poisonous, unnecessary holes. And if so many other people weren't digging more holes and digging deeper holes so that they can live high on the pile of dirt and bodies. Happy solstice. I'm trying to make peace with how much time and energy and resources we spend convincing people just to give a damn. I mean, the world would be so much better if everybody in the world cared just a little more, just like 5% more than they do now. And I'm trying to make peace with how few people are willing to do even that. I'm trying to make peace with all the ways that I'm part of the problem. My comfort is built on other people's suffering. Cheap food, cheap consumer goods, plentiful energy are all at the cost of other people's grotesquely exploited labor and at the cost of pouring garbage into the oceans and the air. And for all of the ways that I am living in holes, clawing my way out of holes and having dirt poured on my head at every turn, there are ways that I won the lottery the day I was born. And it's a lottery that was funded by beating people into the ground and stealing their labor. No matter how careful I am, there is no way to completely disengage from the systems that benefit me at other people's expense. The only way to never hurt anybody is to be a hermit. And I'm trying to make peace with the fact that I don't want to make peace with this. Causing pain and shrugging it off is exactly the thing that I'm struggling against. It's exactly what I don't want people to do. If I'm going to be the person I want to be, I am always going to question my compromises and doubt my motives and wonder if I could have done better. I'm trying to make peace with the fact that no matter how far we push things in the right direction, we will still have to struggle because there will always be people pushing things backwards. We gained ground and lost it so many times. So much of our work is regaining lost ground, and all of our work could be undone in a generation. And as we now know, to our great distress, all of our work could be undone in a day. I'm trying to make peace with the fact that there are always going to be people who benefit from being selfish, heartless, and willing to ignore suffering, and whatever structures we build for justice, there are always going to be people looking for loopholes and looking for ways to game the system to their advantage. Justice is always going to be an arms race. And these people, they're not just the cackling villains, they're not just the 1%. Human nature is selfish as well as selfless. It's callous as well as compassionate. We are, all of us, scared, self-protective, rationalizing, and too willing to say, screw you, Jack, I've got mine. So much of our history records the battles between our better natures and our worse ones. The struggle for justice is a struggle against human nature, so it will always need to be fought, permanently, forever. And I don't know if this is hard for me because I've lived my whole life in the United States, and so many of this country's stories are about winning and happy endings. And I don't know if it's hard because human minds are wired to see life as a narrative. We're wired to see stories with beginnings and middles and ends. And it's very hard to see the struggle as a never-ending story, as a tale that began centuries before we were born and that is going to continue to be told for centuries after we die. I don't know why it's so hard. I'm just trying to make peace with it. At the 2015 American Atheist Convention in Memphis, Anthony Pinn gave a talk on what the atheist movement could learn from hip-hop. By the way, I strongly recommend Dr. Pinn's work. He's extraordinary writer, extraordinary speaker. If you have a chance to see him speak, please do. And at this talk, as he so often does, he said something that very strongly resonated with me, something I was chewing over for months. I actually wrote this piece to a great extent in response to what he said. And this is how he put it in an email to me afterwards. We do what we can, where we can, knowing that oppression is web-like in nature. The proper posture is one of perpetual rebellion against injustice. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The price of justice is permanent struggle. And there is this odd way that permanent struggle brings a degree of peace. Trying to win the struggle for justice, trying to navigate by the non-existent light at the end of the tunnel, groping our way towards a non-existent promised land, that brings a terrible sense of frustration and failure. Letting go of the impossible dream means that we can take satisfaction in our small achievements. And we can take satisfaction in harm reduction. It means we can be smarter about the struggle. We can make better decisions about short-term goals versus bigger pictures. And when we don't win, when we aren't perfect, when we don't see our way, when we don't see any way, it's not because we're not good enough. The fact that I'm not winning and that the people I'm fighting alongside aren't winning doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. The reason we're not winning is that winning is impossible, and winning is not the point. And there's a degree of peace in seeing my work as part of something bigger, a link in a chain. There's peace in being one more descendant of Sisyphus, pushing that rock upward, passing wisdom and experience on to the next generation of people pushing that rock. And there's peace in knowing that with our struggle, that rock would always be at the bottom, grinding people into the ground. I'm trying to make peace with all of this. I'm beginning, maybe, to see okay on the horizon. But struggle, it's not something we do alone. Resistance is not something we do alone. And that brings me to my next question about living an atheist life, a reality-based life. As atheists, how do we build relationships? How do we build secular communities? So much community building is done around religion. Religion often calls itself faith-based communities. How do we build reality-based communities? With other atheists, with each other. Again, this is a very large topic. Atheist community building is a huge topic. I think Greg Epstein and James Croft are actually writing a book about it, which I'm looking forward to. I have a lot to say about it, and I'm sure everybody in this room, in this community, has a lot to say about how we build communities. There is a particular topic that comes up a lot in atheist community building. It is somewhat contentious, but it is hugely important. Also, August asked me to talk about it. So, if we're going to build healthy, thriving, supportive communities that are a relevant part of the resistance that's being built right now, we need to work and really work on diversity, inclusivity, and social justice. From a purely ethical position, this is the right thing to do, but it is also the smart thing to do. It is the evidence-based thing to do. It is the thing to do that accepts reality and responds to it. And that is the case that I'm going to focus on today. Working on diversity and social justice in organized atheism is smart and evidence-based because the evidence suggests strongly that there are female atheists, that there are Black atheists, that there are Latinx atheists, working class and blue-collar atheists, transgender atheists, non-gender binary atheists, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual atheists, atheists of Asian descent, Middle Eastern descent, Native American descent, immigrant atheists, disabled atheists, atheists with mental illness, young atheists, old atheists. All of these folks are atheists. I'm pretty sure the evidence suggests that. And we all need a voice in how this movement is built. Making organized atheism a welcoming place to all of these people and more people that I didn't mention because that list is too long, it's not just the right thing to do. It is how we are going to turn ourselves into a powerhouse. And in the difficult world that's coming, it is how we are going to make ourselves relevant. And when we fail to do this, we have failed at one of the most central parts of our mission, building supportive communities for non-believers. When women show up at meetups and never come back because creepy men were invasively creeping at them, we failed at our mission. When Black people show up at conferences and don't come back because almost all the speakers were white and because nobody talked to them, we have failed at our mission. When people of Asian descent come to our meetups and don't come back because they got told, you speak the language so well. Yeah, I was born here. We have failed at our mission. When Latinx people come to our meetups and don't come back because they were asked, are you in this country legally? We have failed at our mission. When people without a college education come to our meetings or our online forums, our in-person communities or online communities, and don't come back because they heard patronizing talk about how college-educated people are more likely to be atheists, and this means atheism is smarter and better. We have failed at our mission. When young people come to our events and don't come back because every new idea they offered got shot down, and they got told, if you don't like it, it's your fault. If you don't like how things are, what's wrong with you? We have failed at our mission. When trans people come to our events and don't come back because they were asked invasive personal questions about the state of their genitals, We have failed at our mission. When poor people and working class people don't show up for our events because they're expensive or they're not near public transportation, we have failed at our mission. When people with disabilities don't come to our events because they're not accessible, and accessible means a wide range of things, we have failed at our mission. And when marginalized people of all varieties point out any of this or all of this and get gaslighted or dismissed or told to stop talking about it, told to stop being divisive, we have failed at our mission. When marginalized people point out ways that they felt excluded and get told, no, you didn't, or you're being divisive, or we didn't mean to exclude you, therefore you didn't feel excluded, therefore you should stop asking us to change, we have failed at our mission. When marginalized people ask for more focus on issues that concern them and are told no because it would be mission drift, because the mission is defined as what concerns the people who are in the group now, we have failed at our mission. Quick note about mission drift: if you can do highway cleanups and blood drives as an atheist group without it being mission drift, you can work with Planned Parenthood and Black Lives Matter. And when people's basic right to be treated with dignity and equality gets called the 5% we disagree on, and we get asked to shut up about it so that we can work on issues that really matter, the issues we agree on, we have failed at our mission. And I wish I was making this up. All of this is stuff that really happens. I have heard or seen or experienced every one of these. In most cases, I've heard or seen or experienced them again and again and again. There are 100,000 ways that we show unintentional bias towards marginalized people. There's more than ample research on this. Do a Google search if you want on the terms microaggressions and unconscious bias, if you want to see that research. And here's the thing that doesn't make us bad people. What it means is that we have unconsciously picked up the biases of our culture, and that is entirely understandable. What it does mean is that we have to accept this reality and take responsibility for it and work to be better and to do better. And it means that since we have unintentional bias, we have to make a conscious effort to overcome it. It's not going to happen any other way. So I want to wind up tonight, before we get into Q&A and book signing, I want to wind up by moving away from this somewhat contentious topic and moving on towards a more pleasant topic. I actually want to move on to the most pleasant topic of all. I want to wind up by talking about pleasure. And it can be hard to look for pleasure when there is so much that's terrible in the world. It can feel jarring, it can feel cognitively dissonant, even guilty, to take a moment to turn away from the horrors of the world and seek pleasure for ourselves. That can feel selfish and it can just feel weird. But in the difficult years that are ahead, we need pleasure more than ever. Because when we're participating in a resistance movement, pleasure is resistance. Pleasure is self-care. Pleasure refuels us. It gives us reasons to stay alive and to stay in the fight, and self-care is resistance. Self-care makes us strong and it makes us able to fight. Pleasure is a way that we take care of each other, and taking care of each other is resistance. It strengthens all of us and it strengthens the bonds between us. You know, pleasure is how we build a stronger community. You know, pleasure is what motivates us to come to really boring meetings because we had a great time with these people last weekend and we care about them more now. And pleasure is a way that we grow our movement. Making resistance fun is a really great way to bring people into it. And pleasure itself, pleasure for its own sweet sake, is resistance. When we're fighting a fascist groundswell driven in large part by the religious right, when we are fighting an ideology that thinks that people don't own our own bodies, that thinks that God owns our bodies, when we're fighting a regime based on sexist slut-shaming, contempt for queers, hatred and disgust of black and brown bodies, backlash against reproductive rights, Pleasure is defiance. When our pleasure and our bodily autonomy are the exact things that are being oppressed, pleasure is resistance. So let's talk about pleasure. When atheists consider the question of meaning without God, what does it all, let's bring it back around to what does it all mean? We often answer with these big things, what does it all mean? Well, what makes life meaningful? Love, work, art, family and friendship and community and the never-ending search for knowledge and the search to expand our understanding of reality. That's what makes life meaningful. And yes, absolutely it does. All of these are awesome, and they are central parts of how I create meaning in my life. But I want to add a few items to that list. What brings meaning to my life? Donuts, fashion magazines, costume jewelry, cat videos, playing Slash, product placement. I live in San Francisco. One of the things that brings me great pleasure is pretentious, overpriced cocktails with a lot of ridiculous crap in them. Screwing around on Facebook, TiVoing the Olympics, and watching obscure sports I've never heard of before. Cat videos. Coming up with a really sexy, gorgeous, wildly inappropriate outfit for the Dyke March. Padron peppers sautéed in hot oil until they blister and then sprinkled with sea salt. Sitting on the sofa, watching Project Runway and letting cats crawl all over us. Cat videos. The never-ending search for a perfect cup of decaf coffee. I want to speak in praise of frivolity. When we don't think there's any God or any afterlife, we can certainly create meaning from work and art, from charity and activism, from children living after us, our ideas surviving us, the ripples of how we affect people, continuing to ripple out after we're gone. But if other people are the meaning of our life, what meaning do their lives have? If we exist to make other people happy, and they exist to make still other people happy, at what point does that end? At some point, doesn't experience get to matter simply because it matters? Consciousness is amazing. All of it. The overflowing love I felt the day my wife Ingrid and I got married was amazing. And the deliciousness I tasted the other morning when I ate tangerines and drank coffee was amazing. The sense of accomplishment and community I felt the day I published my first book was amazing. And my hysterical, uncontrollable laughter when we were playing Zombie Flux at the Hot Chocolate and Games Party was amazing. The connection I felt with my friends Rebecca and Gerard in this intense conversation we had about queer history was amazing. And the connection I felt with Ingrid in our intense conversation last night about how awesome our cats were was amazing. The frivolous bits of life are the universe knowing itself, experiencing itself, and taking joy in itself. Carl Sagan said, the universe, we are a way for the universe to understand itself. We are also a way for the universe to give itself pleasure. In the frivolous bits of life, they are the conscious bits of the universe connecting with each other. One person designs a hot pink dress and another person wears it and smiles at their reflection in a mirror. One person paints a picture of a parrot on the sidewalk and another person snaps a picture of it and puts it on their blog. One person takes a video of their cat and another person likes it on Facebook. One person makes a donut and another person bites into it and experiences joy. When we let go of the idea that life is only meaningful because of God, when we truly accept that meaning is ours to create, we can stop being size queens about meaning. When we let go of the idea that joy only matters when it brings glory to an omnipotent creator, we can let all joy matter. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.